Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Owen Hiughes, who's someone that I've known since, well, probably a long time. We shouldn't really say how long, but anyway, certainly the late 70s. I've known Owen since then. He's a welcome recent addition to the JCIPP as an adjunct professor. Originally from WA, he did his degree and PhD in politics at the University of Western Australia. And he worked at the University of Tasmania for a few years, and then for 26 years in the Faculty of Business and Economics at Monash University in Victoria, followed by 5 years of Dean of Students at RMIT University in Melbourne. His teaching was mostly at graduate level in public management, but also international relations, strategy and management. And he's got many publications, including Business, Government and Globalisation, The Art of Strategy, and perhaps best known for his book, Public Management and Administration, which first appeared in 1994. The fifth edition came out in 2018. It's been translated into several languages, including Turkish, Mongolian and Spanish, and he's got several editions in Chinese. So there's plenty of students in China who've read Owen Hiughes. As I said, I've known Owen for a long time, but we haven't had much to do with each other in recent years. So it's great to have him back in the fold and associated with the JCIPP and Curtin. So Owen, thank you so much for agreeing to be our speaker today. We're really looking forward to it, and I'll leave it to you. Over to you.
Hi, everyone, and I'm speaking to you from Melbourne today. One thing that I could add to what John was just saying is that way back, we had at UWA a politics club, and I was president of the politics club and had to hand over to somebody else. So I thought there's no one better than John. So John Philibor became the president of the politics club after me. So he's probably forgotten that point. Anyway, in joining John Curtin Institute of Public Policy as an adjunct, it brings me back in some ways to Western Australia, even though I'll be staying here in Melbourne. But John asked if I would talk about a new book that I had come out last year. So this is that new book. It came out in May last year. I always thought this was a pandemic book or something to do in lockdown. And although for a few years I did teach an MBA course called Strategy and Policy, and a lot of the things that are talked about today come directly from that course. In fact, the framework that I used, which I call the 5-factor framework, was derived by myself with the students. So we workshopped a framework that was reasonably small in number, but covered all the main aspects. And so we came up in the end with 5. And then we ran that framework for a few years, and I have to say it went very well. The framework was in the advertisement for what is today. So it's purpose, capability, will, terrain, and tactics. And a lot of strategic instances can be looked at using such a framework, and not all, and in some cases, some are more emphasized than others, but it is a framework that provides some insight, even though it can never be perfect, as it's only a framework. Okay, now strategy. I think I have too much information today for the time, given that the football is on not too far off. But so some of the bits I might have to hurry through somewhat, but I'll try and keep it reasonably consistent. Anyway, strategy, everyone has looked at strategy. It is a term that does derive from the military, where it refers to the objective of winning a war as opposed to tactics, like a distinction between strategy and tactics that goes back in some ways to Clausewitz. Any organization needs to ask, why does it exist? What is it trying to do? Where is it going? So, and it follows from that strategy could be considered as a single unifying concept rather than being divided too much into international strategy versus business strategy or something else like that. It is about logic, about applying logic to situations and moving from the known to the unknown or not yet known, from an idea, a goal, and by applying resources and getting to a result. Now, how to illustrate strategy? There's many different ways. There's people who use say, there's a book by a business academic called Parker Bowes that looks at Alexander the Great and his contribution to strategy. This one I don't find terribly satisfactory, but it is used. The idea, though, of looking at past theorists or past ideas, past history, is by no means unusual, and I can't profess to any great insight here or great originality. But these are three that I've borrowed on more than others. So Sun Tzu, or Master Sun, as they say more correctly, says a lot about terrain and tactics, but also about motivation and about leaders indirectly. Clausewitz is the great theorist of war, which he does not see as a particularly novel kind of enterprise, that it is an extreme but natural extension of policy. So the well-known phrase, war is nothing but the continuation of policy by other means. And most of all, for me anyway, Machiavelli. For Machiavelli, it's the beginning of secularism, and he has a real understanding, I think, of people and their motivations, even if these tend to be more about their weaknesses rather than their strength. But the key point for me is the realist. The world needs to be looked at as it is, as a matter of logic and science, if later, and not as a fantasy or as something preordained by God. In my book, I use the 5-factor model, as already mentioned, and use historical examples, exactly as Machiavelli does in The Prince, where he makes a general point and then illustrates it with something from Italian history at the time, or something from Roman history hundreds of years in the past. So the idea is that you can make general points out of historical or other kinds of examples. Strategy is often seen as analogous to war. I find this a little odd, as I'll explain. We often use analogies, so capturing market share or maneuvers or killing the opposition even, which is kind of dumb, but is often said in business. And the idea of strategic plans does come directly from an analogy with the military. So businesses were encouraged to develop an advanced plan, resources to implement the plan, and devices to signal when plan modification was required, from Nutt and Backhoff, who write about strategy in the public sector. Examples from the strategy can be taken from anywhere, I think. And this is the 5-factor framework, which I developed with the MBA students. It did change a bit over time. Will became sometimes will and leadership. And it was only added a bit later. So the first year we did the course, I think it was purpose, capability, terrain and tactics, but there was something missing. So the 5th one is, I think, good, even though using these words does make for a somewhat awkward acronym. So PCWTT is not like the 5 S's or the 6 P's or any of those, or blue ocean strategy or any of those sort of snappy ones. But for me, these are the best words to describe the area in which they are involved. Anyway, you'll see how we use this while moving on a bit. So first one, purpose. And by any measure, purpose is the most important thing. It is the most important of the 5-factor framework. Purpose is the reason for which something is done or created, or for which something exists. It is fundamental reason for existence, the raison d'etre. It's much more high level, more serious than mission. You know, mission is kind of a low level day-to-day thing, or vision, or goal. These are phenomena, but they are lower order ones. What am I trying to do here? What is the ultimate goal? What will success look like? These are the fundamental questions about purpose. Now, heading straight into a case study of Pearl Harbor and Midway. This comes almost, well, quite directly without being in any ways stolen. When I was in second year at UWA, I did a history course called Maritime History. It was taught by a remarkable professor called Frank Brusser, who unfortunately died very young. Anyway, this was a tutorial topic in that course, was about Pearl Harbor, and we had to really think about whether it was good strategy or bad strategy. So it's something that I've been ever since really interested in and really following up on. So here we have Admiral Yamamoto, who was the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was personally against the war with the US. He'd visited the US. He'd been at Harvard. He knew that the Japanese could not match US industrial might, but still went ahead because he was loyal, and said the only way that he could carry on would be if the US Pacific Fleet was taken out, and taken out early on. And even though it was something of an accident, taken out by not declaring war if it came to that. The southern drive into and the overall strategy was to drive into Indochina, to the Dutch East Indies for oil, Philippines and Singapore to knock out local American and British forces, remembering, of course, that there was war on in Europe, and so that the colonial powers were relatively weak as it went. He did say something, though, when the plan was being developed a year before. If I'm told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. Bear that in mind. So the strategy then is to seize a defensive line after knocking out or destroying, neutralizing the US Pacific Fleet, and then to defend that line and to use Malaya and Indonesia and Indochina as resources for Japan, in particular, to help it with its war in China that it was currently struggling to do much with. So the idea, so far as there was one, was to neutralize the US Pacific Fleet, race out to set up a defense perimeter and use the resources of Southeast Asia, and then negotiate a favorable peace, aiming to keep some of those areas then. We could call it a quixotic plan, but then we didn't find that out till much later. So we all know what happened. But it was an aberration, Pearl Harbor. It was a raid. It was not a preliminary to conquest. It was just seen as a way of wiping out the Navy and getting a free hand in the Pacific, particularly the West in the Pacific. So there was no clear warning for the Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor was not identified as a target, and battleships were berthed at Pearl Harbor for the weekend for liberty. Importantly, though, the two aircraft carriers were not there. They were based there, but they were out delivering aircraft. So they were not there at the time of the attack. A book about Pearl Harbor has the title, At Dawn We Slept. It was a very apt title because that was what actually happened. The US was caught unaware. The aftermath, the fleet was destroyed. The result generally not anticipated. The US declared war on Japan, and as the current president at the time said, this was a day of infamy. 7th of December 1941 would go down in history as a day of infamy. A few days later, Hitler declared war on the US, a fairly odd thing to do, but he did. and American public opinion changed in favor of war. It had previously been highly isolationist and against war in Europe. But the phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" became a catch cry, a slogan to use for the entire 4 years that followed, close to 4 years. Jumping right ahead to Midway, this in the book, this goes for many more pages, but we don't have a lot of time today. 6 months later, almost to the day, there is a monumental battle of Midway. A mere 6 months later, almost exactly as Yamamoto had said, it all came really to a sudden end. The war was effectively over, even though no one knew it then. And it would take a further 3 years to come true, because the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor with a fleet of 6 carriers. 2 of them had been damaged at Coral Sea, in May, June, but they were later repaired. So there were 4 Japanese carriers that attacked Midway. All 4 were sunk. 3 of them were sunk within 6 minutes of each other, and 1 a little later. The war, in some ways, was already over. The first 3 carriers were turned into wrecks within 6 minutes, and then the 4th one survived. 1 American carrier was sunk later, but this was far more damaging to the Japanese than to the Americans, who were already building a lot of aircraft carriers and ended up the war with by some counts, more than 100, where the Japanese never were able to recover from the loss of the 4 carriers and the pilots that went down at Midway. Okay, now that's a very shorthand sort of thing, but the question is, what was the strategy here? What were they trying to do? And while this question would take several hours in my class, we don't have that kind of time now. The idea was to give themselves 12 to 14, 24 months of freedom to act without US interference. But there was no real strategy beyond that other than to sue for peace. The way that the war was started meant, though, that achieving any kind of outcome was simply not possible. No American president could negotiate with anyone who had attacked them without declaring war. The only possible outcome for the Americans immediately was unconditional surrender. The strategic lessons, the island chain strategy, which is that they go out and seize a defensive line, was a total failure because they could not resource the islands that they had captured. And very quickly, in fact, within a month or 2, the supply through shipping of goods and through the Navy was severely disrupted by American submarines, who were far more effective there than the German submarines were in the North Atlantic. The purposes were unclear and unrealistic, overly dependent on, where am I going? Right. Overly dependent on an assumption that the US would have a failure of will, that they were not up to competing with the Japanese and their far greater will. So that leads on to, well, we'll look at that in a bit. The second of my 5 factors is capability. So capability is more than resource capacity. Capability is how capable you are, which also means capable in resources of all kinds, but relative to another party or parties. You can't be perfectly capable. You're capable compared to someone else. This category includes these things: money, resources, potential as well as actual resources, etc. Organization, logistics, intelligence. It's derives fairly easily from Clausewitz, but also Sun Tzu. So which general has the greater ability, whose forces are stronger, whose rewards and punishments are clearer, etc. It's how capable you are. Going back to the first example, US production of aircraft was far in excess of Japan. When they got going, they were producing a new airplane every 5 minutes, a new ship every 4 or 5 days, pilot training far in excess, and all this for a GDP that was 10 times the size of that of Japan. There was never, they were never in the hunt. They only went to war because they thought they had been pushed into a corner. But strategically, it was an error. Other instances of disparity in resources: the American Civil War. Northern states could mobilize 4 million fighting men, the Confederacy 1,100,000. The North had most of the industry, most of the railways, and its navy was able to blockade the southern ports. But importantly, resources do not win by themselves. They need to be directed and led. This then leads very quickly and easily into the next category, which is will. Will is more than capability and purpose. It's being willing to act. I mean, it's hard to use will without using willing. It's acting, being ready to commit. You could have every other feature in place, but still not move, still not act. So will and leadership are related. In fact, one of the students said that he thought that leadership was the manifestation of will, the visible manifestation of will. So there's something in that. Including will in the factors as a separate item really comes down to one person, and that's this one. George McClellan was the chief leading general of the Union in the first part of the Civil War. He had capability, far greater resourcing than the South, but he always believed he had less. He was extremely cautious, always wanted more time for more training, always wanted more money, always wanted more weapons, etc. In fact, President Lincoln said at one point, if General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time. Eventually, he got sick of the delayed excuses and found other generals who would move, even if they were not as smooth or as even educated as McClellan was. They had will, and so Grant and Sherman especially were those here. Moving right along, and the book jumps back and forward with historical figures. So Julius, or Big Julius, you might be called. Julius is the complete opposite to McClellan. His complete will, like his strength of will and other kinds of things. I once read, well, actually more than once now, the Conquest of Gaul, which is written by Julius Caesar. And when you read that, you realize how modern Julius is. He's completely up to date with now, even, and was in lots of ways anachronistic rather than something that is back then. He's modern. Anyway, all of these things, one to pick out probably is the brutal and deadly game of Roman domestic politics. The motivation for all that he did was at home in Rome, was competing with other politicians and competing in that forum, to use a word. Ultimately, he failed. And in some ways, he fails because he thought that he was better than everyone, and he was better than everyone, and they knew he was better. But that kind of strength of will cannot do everything, which comes also back to the Japanese in World War II. There seemed to be an assumption that even if the US was bigger and richer, it did not possess the will and fighting spirit of the Japanese, who could overcome all odds. Sheer will could overcome all, they thought, but of course it cannot and did not. Number 4, terrain. So terrain is a conformation of the land in one way, but also could be seen more specifically as a field on which a contest is to take place. So the terrain for a land battle is the mountains and streams and all that kind of stuff. But terrain can also include the sea, the oceans. It can also include space. It can also include all sorts of features that are outside the contest, but they affect it. So in World War II, the invasion of Normandy was able to go ahead because the British and the Americans had better meteorologists than the Germans. So they were able to foresee a break in the clouds and a break in the storm that was raging for June the 6th. So they went ahead on June the 6th. The Germans thought that the weather was so bad that there would be nothing happening. So they even went on leave. Rommel went back to Berlin to see his family because it was thought the weather was so bad that June the 6th wouldn't happen. But of course it did. I'm just conscious of the time. I need to move on. Sun Tzu talks a lot about terrain, about how you use the mountains, how you use rivers, how you do that kind of stuff. It's well worth reading. It's only, the whole of Sun Tzu is only something like 4,500 words, but it's full of great insight. Here's a very quick example of terrain. Back in 1776, the Battle of New York, or the Battle of Long Island, the British were in total control of the sea. So the British Navy had total control of the sea. They landed 35,000 troops on Staten Island, and then crossed into Long Island on their way to Manhattan. A big battle on Long Island, followed by another one in Brooklyn and along Manhattan. These battles were won very convincingly by the British. They had more people, they had more experience. The Americans were simply outplayed, were lucky to escape. But escape they did. They escaped over the East River into Manhattan. Some more battles there, and then they ended up going right up to the top of Manhattan Island, crossing into New York, and then eventually across the river into New Jersey. The important thing here is that if George Washington had been like other generals of the day, he would have just kept fighting in the European way. But he didn't do that. He did something very clever instead. He said, he decided after having such a hard time in this part and in this kind of fighting, he concluded on our side the war should be defensive. We should on all occasions avoid a general action or put anything to the risk unless compelled by necessity. He resolved to keep his army in being, but it would be a retreating army, defending what it could, yielding when it must, keeping the field and watching for an opportunity. This use of terrain is actually strategic genius. As long as Washington could keep his army together, he could not be defeated because he could just go into the hinterland away from the Navy, and the American wilderness or the American hinterland was so vast it could not be held by any British army of the day. So Washington was disparaged, and sometimes is still disparaged for running away, but it was the right thing to do in terms of strategy. He did exactly what he should have, and ended up winning as it turned out. Right. Tactics, the last one. Tactics is, as Clausewitz says, it's the use of armed forces in battle, whereas strategy forms a theory of using battle for the purpose of the war. So it's lower level actions, but these lower level actions need to be in accordance with the overall strategy. Coming back to my Pearl Harbor example again, I'll skip over that one. Superficially, the tactics were clever, but several mistakes were made in a tactical sense. Battleships were targeted, but were already obsolete. A year before, the large parts of the Italian fleet had been sunk at harbour by aeroplanes from Britain. There was no good defence against aircraft. They were already obsolete, and it was known that they're obsolete. In fact, the Japanese were out to prove that they were obsolete. They were targeted though, and other things were left. But except for one of the battleships, which is still in the water there, the others sunk into shallow harbour and were able to be recovered and were used later in the war. Importantly too, aircraft carriers were not in the harbour on the day. They were far more useful and effective as capital ships than the battleships, but they weren't there. So that's a tactical mistake. Importantly also, such facilities like oil tanks, the submarine base, machine shops were not attacked. If they had been rendered useless, the Americans would have had to withdraw to the West Coast, but they were not harmed. And fairly quickly, as it turned out, Pearl Harbor was able to be reinstated as not only a base, but the main US base in the Pacific. So this was something that I drew some years ago. Business schools always like to do 2x2 matrices. So here we have 4 possibilities for good and bad strategy and tactics. By any measure, the attack on Pearl Harbor was bad strategy and bad tactics. This is what I remember saying in Frank Bruce's class, and I was afraid that I was wrong, but I was not. Right, now I'm looking at the time and trying to draw to a conclusion. Some concluding comments. Strategy is about a simple question: what do we do next? What choices need to be made? It is about methods that can be brought to bear, choices that can be made from the many that are available, the principles and theories that can be drawn on so that the path chosen is the best in the circumstances. Strategy is serious. It may be the greatest game, but is also important for the futures of other people, hundreds, thousands, or even millions of them. It is argued here that strategy can be usefully illuminated by looking at the 5 facets: purpose, capability, will, terrain, and tactics. Yeah, a couple more things. Some caveats. This is not complete. There's a long way to go, and it will never be complete. One caveat is that winners write the history. So if the Japanese had won World War II, the history would be very different. It is based on reason, therefore it is rational, but there are many examples of rationality and lack of strategy. World War I, a dreadful and horrible conflict. It's still unclear why it started. And most, if not all, participants were worse off as a result. There was no winner there. And the Pearl Harbor case should never have happened. Strategy was poor, the tactics were poor, but it took the deaths of some 22 million people to show that. Okay, now two more things. When I got to do the cover of my book, I was tasked to look at Getty Images and find something that would suit, and then send it off to London for them to just design a cover around it. So I chose this, which is, as some of you would know, the road between Perth and Adelaide along the Nullarbor Cliffs. So I don't know how many people in the world would realise that, but I chose that because I've been along that road many times and find it a fairly remarkable part of the world. Then this last one, this is my last slide. If there is a general lesson in this, it is that strategy needs to be approached with care. Now here is one of the things which I miss about Western Australia, and having lived in the East now for 40 years, I still miss the sunset and the sun going into the sea. It is a remarkable thing that I hope that everyone who's still over there goes and sees often. That's it. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Owen. That's great. Just do one more thing. Just end your slide sharing the screen. That way you and I can be on the...
Okay, your screen sharing, stop share. Okay.
Perfect, we're in. Okay, so just want to remind everybody, if you want to go into Slido and ask some questions, there already are a few up there already. Just go to www.slido.com or download the app, and our code is JCIPP. So thanks for that, Owen. Got a couple of questions already coming up. One, which I was going to ask, which is great, someone else has thought of it first. Strategy is engaging hearts and minds. Co-creation can tap into wisdom or creativity and ownership. But what differs between military strategy and organisational strategy? Because obviously you've done work on public management and on organisations more generally. Most of your examples have come from the military today, but I know your book, I'm sure, talks about organisations more generally. So engaging hearts and minds, how do you differ between military strategy and organisational strategy? What are the lessons for organisations more generally? I mean, for example, Curtin University just released its strategic plan yesterday. So and it's probably high in the minds of quite a few Curtin people at the moment about our new strategy. So what's the lesson for organisations?
Oh, well, there's a couple of things there. The first one is that I think that the analogy of business or other strategy with military is always a bit laboured, even though it's often done, because military strategy has lethality attached to it. That if you make a mistake, you're dead. I don't know any business strategy or a Curtin strategy where the stakes are quite that high. The stakes, you might lose your job or something like that, but you're not going to get killed for doing something strategically wrong. The other thing about strategy generally is that it should be seen as a way of thinking, a way of getting from a goal to an outcome. So the simplest kind of a strategy is just to have a purpose, throw some resources at it, and get a result. So the result from the idea is what I think strategy is about generally, whether military or organisational.
But I'm assuming, so you went through the first 3 of you or 5 there, but also the terrain. I guess there's a business terrain, or the terrain. Yeah, right. Organisations will be the understanding the business terrain, or in higher education, the understanding the policy and other areas that you have to take into account, correct?
All of that stuff. And in fact, I think that terrain is a better term even for that than the environment. Like you could say everything is the environment, or so saying the higher education sector is the terrain, or Perth, higher education in Perth. That's a narrower terrain, but it's a real one.
Okay. Got a question here, going back, another obvious question, in a sense, obvious question to ask, but I'm pleased someone's asked it, about Ukraine, the Ukrainian war at the moment. Is there a parallel there between the Japanese general's comments about individual effort in the first 6 months and the war 2 to 3 years on? We had a speaker, which you may not have seen, Alexei Moraviev, one of our key commentators here on the Ukrainian situation, talking a few weeks ago about this issue. So it would seem from the outside that the Russians have got potentially overwhelming industrial military power, but it's not happened at the moment, and one of the key reasons seems to be will. So what's your take on Ukraine using your model?
Well, there's a lot of things I could say there. I've been following it avidly, as you might imagine. With I look at the Washington Post and New York Times every day. I look at The Economist every day, et cetera, et cetera. I'm reading all this stuff. And it was interesting the other day, a Ukrainian military spokesman, in commenting on the attack on the Russians from the north, in the north, said, well, war is the art of deception, which is word for word Sun Tzu. So that was, I thought, quite a good point to make. I think one of the issues there, and we don't know how this is going to pan out, is that what does a Russian victory look like? The outcome of a strategy is to be able to say, what does success look like? How am I going to know that I've succeeded? Well, how are they going to know that they've succeeded? Because the more the war drags on, the more that Ukraine moves away from being part of a larger Russia, unless they turn the whole place into Grozny and level it. Another thing there is I have another pandemic book that comes out in January. It's called The Crisis of Governance. And there's a bit of Ukraine in that already, even though that was written a few months ago. That where do we go from here? Like a country with, seemingly with a single ruler can do anything up to a point. We're a country where there are many stakeholders. It's harder to get everyone together, So I was starting to worry very severely that we're heading for an age of authoritarianism, where free exchange like we are currently doing becomes unusual or unknown. I wouldn't like to see that. And so Ukraine, oddly, is an affirmation of another kind of ideal about the West. The West is not a place, it's a set of values.
Okay. A couple of questions that sort of link to each other, slightly different but nuances, but they have at their core the same sort of issue, which is the connection between strategy and rationality. The first question says strategy is rational, but is it amoral? What role does a moral compass play in strategy? But before you answer that one, the second question was, how should irrational decisions be handled? Where overwhelming strength is available because it's there, like Putin, Ukraine, World War II, etc. But so where does rationality come in? Because sometimes it would never be rational to act if you feel like, well, we're clearly at a weak, got a weak hand here, so therefore we just say, okay, we give up. There's no way we can do anything. So rationality and strategy, firstly, and also morality and strategy. So you talked about purpose, but does purpose have to be moral, or can you actually have an amoral purpose, or does in fact amorality actually sort of sap your will? So either of those, in whichever order you want to do.
Well, we're getting a bit philosophical here, which is no bad thing in some ways. The big question about the Japanese in World War II is the irrationality. That how could a society, even though it was kind of a dictatorship at the time, think that they can win when they have 10% of the GDP? How can they do that? But they also, in some ways parallel to Ukraine, they saw themselves as being pushed into a corner by the Americans cutting off oil supply. That they were pushed into a corner. If they don't act now, they won't be able to later. Now that's the way that the Russians have expressed the somewhat irrational thought that they're being pushed by Europe and the Americans, by NATO getting closer. But it may be an irrational feeling, but it's something that is still felt. So the Japanese thought they were being pushed into a corner. So they had to strike out. Dealing with the rationality is probably the problem, rather than the irrationality itself. So the thought, the reason that the Americans were taken by surprise is that they knew the Japanese, they knew of them, they didn't think that they would do it. They just thought it would be completely and utterly irrational for the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor, but they did it anyway. So you could go back to the madman strategy. Like, remember Nixon thought that it was a viable thing to be seen as a madman by the other side, because then they'd be taken by surprise. They were not, if you were seen as being irrational, it provided an advantage. Kind of an odd way of looking at the world, but even so. Now, morality, there's this is a problem that Machiavelli had himself. That he thought that half of what anyone did was supplied by fortune, but the other half was by their own thoughts and actions. This was fairly monumental at the time, because the church told people how they had to think, and that the morality was what the church said. But Machiavelli gave people some aspect or some fraction of free will. And that's, I think, the main reason why the prince was banned by the Vatican for 300 or more years, because it said that people could make up their own mind. Now, is morality something that one does oneself, or is something that is supplied by others, like an authority? I don't know. But the rationality, I think, is in the steps that follow. So you don't, the idea or the purpose may be odd or irrational, but the step from that to resourcing to action, if those are also irrational, then the outcome can be chaotic and not logical.
Okay. I've got a question here from Tim Diamond. Hi, Tim, regular of Curtin Corner. Will, your third factor, seems to be very subjective and hard to quantify. So what are the sources of political will, and how can you plan to have it? I mean, you can't just sort of wake up one morning, I assume, and just possess will. I mean, I assume it comes from somewhere. So where does political will come from?
Well, I suppose from people or an individual thinking that they have an answer for something, that they know and can convince others. There's no certainty about how one quantifies will. It's just an outcome, that the other four were easier to quantify, and that's for sure. But then you still have the problem of General McClellan. He's got everything else in place, but then doesn't act. Why? So that one, he has purpose. Like he was against slavery. He was a loyal soldier. He had astonishing amount of capability. They had a lot more resourcing than the Southerners did. The terrain was equally bad for both of them, and the tactics were similar. But what he didn't have was the desire to just go ahead, to move, to press on. So that's will for me.
Okay. Bruce has been patient because he asked this question a little while back. How can governments develop effective signalling mechanisms to enable plan modification when there's a political cost to admitting error? So back, it was a phrase about, all wars, sort of best laid plans off go glay sort of things. So in other words, as soon as battle commences, the plans go out the window almost. So how do you develop these mechanisms to modify your plans? And is there a difference between modifying your tactics but not modifying your strategy, or does your strategy itself sometimes have to be modified in the face of events and the adversary, if you like, if there's an adversary?
Well, if you're talking about politics, like I think one piece of great wisdom was by Enoch Powell, even though he's a fairly strange character, all political careers end in failure. And he has a point. All political careers do end in failure, because the mere fact that it ends is a failure. And his own certainly ended in failure. But one of the things that I like about politics, and we probably talked about this before, is that it is imperfect. That you make adjustments, you try and convince people. It's about talking, about carrying on. Plans. In fact, the quote from von Moltke is in the book somewhere. That plans do not survive the first contact with the enemy. And but that doesn't mean you don't have a plan. It's just that you have a plan that has flexibility in it. But explaining the flexibility or explaining why you've had to change course, there's no easy answer as to how you do that.
So, changing course and explaining it, how does that not morph into admitting error? Because it does seem that politicians in particular are often very, very loath to admit error. I know some have made an art form of being able to apologise, Peter Beattie types, but in general, politicians don't want to admit they've made a mistake. I'll find any other reason why they've had to change their mind due to circumstances. They won't admit error. Why is that?
Well, I suppose
maybe not just politicians, by the way. It could also be business leaders and others too.
It's a cost-benefit equation. That if you lose more by admitting error, then that's one side of it. If you gain more by admitting error, then that's another thing. If it's done well, I would have thought that you don't lose by admitting error, because it's an imperfect world. That was one of the things that there's a debate on here in Victoria about the pandemic lockdowns. Daniel Andrews shouldn't have ever locked down, and that kind of thing. You go, no. At the time, that was the outcome that was needed. It was the advice that he was getting. In hindsight, you can say it was an error, but it wasn't at the time. And I think that would be asking too much to. And if I were him, I would not admit error. I would say we did the best that we could at the time. The same with Mark McGowan. He said that we were we kept the state shut down until there was a sufficient number of people vaccinated. That's entirely fine.
So Scott Morrison, if he'd actually admitted early on, yes, they'd stuffed up on the vaccines or something, might have got some credit for it, rather than sort of trying to, bluster his way through saying we didn't change our mind. We never said that in the first place.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, a couple more questions, then we'll get ready to finish. Isn't there a real risk that strategy can become short term? The purpose is to achieve X without thinking long term. And
Yeah.
Yes.
Agree. That I think strategy is the big picture, as Paul Keating would say. It's big picture. It's not little picture. In fact, strategy as a word is overused in being applied to low-level things that are really plans or just a day-to-day kind of thing. It's not a strategy. A strategy is big. It's not little. It's big picture.
But big picture can also be long term.
It should be, yeah.
Okay. Given that no plan survives the first encounter with the enemy, as you mentioned, how dynamic then does the strategy have to be? And how do you balance continuity, i.e. purpose, with change? So, yeah, I mean, that's a tricky question to answer, isn't it? Because you may have this firm purpose be knocked off course straight away. And then maybe you realise then your capability isn't up to it, or you haven't got the right terrain and your purpose is actually not going to happen. So you have to change purpose then, or do you just find other ways to achieve it through other means?
Well, I think that's why it's an art, not a science. The science of strategy is not something that I would ascribe myself to. I would say it's an art. Some people are good at it and others are not. It is an art.
Okay, we've got another question here. Last one, I think. I suppose will was something that Joan of Arc had an abundant supply. Anyway, great. How can you define what exactly that is and where it comes from? What will is and where it comes from? The same question that Tim asked before. This seems to be the tricky one that people are interested in. And of course, and it does clearly, will seems to make a difference, and morale makes a difference on the battlefield, it seems. It probably makes a difference between some, you could find two businesses look exactly the same, but one's got people who are enthusiastic and make things happen, the other one, people are just doing their job 9 to 5. So I guess will does make a lot of difference.
Yes, I agree. It does make a lot of difference, but it can't do everything. But will combined with the other things, so you talked about Ukraine before. The Ukrainians have shown that they are willing to fight, that they know how to fight. You give them the capacity or the capability by providing weapons, and they do extremely well. Whether that then becomes the answer or the outcome, who knows yet? But I would have thought that they're displaying will extremely well.
So you did your little 2x2 diagram before. Have you tried to do a little bit of a matrix here and work out which of the 5 factors is indispensable, as opposed to which ones, or is there any sequencing involved? One without the other can't happen. I mean, what's the other? Is any of those 5 the particular magic dust you need to make things happen?
Yeah, the big one, the big kahuna, or the numero uno, is purpose. That if you have an unclear purpose, then you're not going to get a result, or you're not going to get a result easily, and the purposes become changeable from day to day. Well, purpose needs to be a bit clearer than that. That's one thing about the Russians. What is the purpose now? Especially now, when the Ukrainians did not go out into the street with garlands of roses welcoming them. The purpose is being stuck to, even though it clearly isn't working or didn't work. Now, they may still win the war, but what does that look like?
The next book you're going to write on is The Art of Retreat, because that must be a really tricky thing, I assume, because if your strategy, maybe you find out halfway through, actually the strategy wasn't clear and we haven't got the right capability or will, and it's not working. How one retreats is a difficult one. I mean, I'm thinking even in business cases, or for example, in traditional industrial relations has talked about this. The coal miners' strike in Britain in the 80s, for example.
Yeah.
It was pretty clear you know, once Thatcher said she wasn't going to change, that the coal miners were hiding to nothing. They kept on fighting and fighting and fighting. You know, the union was going broke, but they just wouldn't change. And I think it was partly because they didn't want to lose face. Now, on a much more lethal front, you could argue the same is happening here in Russia and in Ukraine. So how does one find, you know, artful retreat so that you know, we can walk away and start again, as opposed to just, you know, the strategy then becomes, you know, thou shalt not allow us to not be seen as a great power.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things that spring to mind there. The first is that I've got a friend who I've got a bet with, and that the stakes of the bet is a bottle of beer. I bet him, who is kind of pro-Russian, you know, which is interesting for the purpose of what we're talking about here. I said that Putin will be gone in 6 months. Right. Well, the 6 months is up on Sunday. Now, it's unlikely that it's going to go in 2 days, but I would have thought that looking at history or looking at what happens in such situations, he cannot survive for long. Only by totally changing course or doing something else. Or I can't see how it adds up. And then the other thing, though, is George Washington. When I've read the stories about George, what jumps out at me is that he is a strategic genius, but he gets criticized all the time for having lost all the battles that he was ever in, and criticized for running away. But he did exactly the right thing when he ran away. And then the other thing in that quote was that they would look for opportunities as they arose. In the middle of winter, in fact, it was Christmas Day, the very small army that George had attacked the town of Trenton, where there were German mercenaries there. Christmas Day, they were all drunk. Well, they were claimed to be drunk in the snow, and Washington won a great victory, a victory that was enough for the French to decide to join the Americans against the British. So a small thing then has a giant result, but all from running away. Okay,
well, it's time for us to run away. It's 5:05. We have to run away. We can just go away, watch the football, and see whose team strategies work tonight and whose works tomorrow afternoon. So, Owen, it's been great to reconnect. It's great to have you talk. People, check out his book, and also there's a new one coming out, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. And thanks very much for appearing tonight, Owen. That's great.
Okay, thanks, John.
Thanks. And everybody else, just letting you know, we don't have a curtain corner next Friday because the Friday is squeezed between the two holidays. We've got the long weekend the following Monday, and also on the Thursday, of course, we've got the National Day of Mourning for the demise of Her Majesty. So, but on Wednesday, we do have an in-person event at the council chambers here at Bentley campus at 4 o'clock, where Sergio Farmiano, a local urban planner, is going to be discussing his new book, The New Australian Dream, Rethinking Our Homes and Cities to Solve the Housing Crisis. So that's next Wednesday evening, 4 o'clock. We would have sent you a note about how you can register for that. That's going to be in person, and you can buy the book at the event. So that's next Wednesday. And then our next curtain corner is in a fortnight's time in 2 weeks, on the 30th of September. So, Owen, thanks again. Have a great night, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you at a future curtain corner. Good night.
Okay, thanks, John.
Thanks. See you.